It's my great pleasure to introduce Catherine Travis. I won't spend much time doing so, as she's very well known to you all. But for the record, she is Chair of Modern European Languages at the College of Arts and Social Sciences at the ANU, which is where she got her honours degree. So she's also a member of the Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language, one of the CIs in that quite incredible centre. And she was at the University of New Mexico for 10 years, I think, prior to happily coming back to Australia. So she's talking about English today, but of course, Catherine's done an incredible amount of work on Spanish, especially in relation to bilingualism and code switching and matters of social interaction and social indexicality and community and so forth in Spanish. But also prior to that, I'm not sure how much actually you've done since, but wonderful work on Japanese. So, you know, she's well known nowadays for being a variationist sociolinguist, but has this very strong background in pragmatics and semantics. So I kind of wanted to give a shout out to her 2005 book on discourse markers in Colombian Spanish, which I would highly recommend as a masterclass on interactional semantics and on semantic analysis generally. It's this fantastic treatment of what discourse markers mean and how they can have multiple meanings and so forth. So budding semanticists would be well advised to consult that book. And more recently, Catherine's 2018 book, Bilingualism in the Community, Code Switching and Grammars in Contact, summarizes, I suppose, a large amount of work that has been done over the years on Spanish. So that's co-authored with her colleague Rina Torres Cacuyos. Have I said that right? Good. So it's a great pleasure to have you here. As we were just saying, sad that you're not physically here as we had anticipated you might be. But in any case, we have you giving a talk, and the talk today is going to be on ethnicity and social class in a modern metropolis. I'm going to hand over to Catherine, but can I just say, we'll do kind of Q&A as usual at the end. You can use the chat function in Zoom to register a question or a query or something you want to raise for discussion at the end. That way, you know, Catherine can see, sort of review and manage her own Q&A, and we can jump in if need be, of course. And I don't, you know, wouldn't require you to monitor the chat through your actual talk, so you can leave that aside. But if something sort of urgent is coming up, I will interrupt you. But for now, let me hand over to you, and I look very much forward to your talk on ethnicity and social class in a modern metropolis. Catherine.
Great, thanks, Nick. And thanks everyone for coming along. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to present my work to you guys, in particular as Sydney-siders, and it's so great to be able to share this with Sydney-siders, and it'll be terrific to get your feedback on on the linguistic analysis, but also sort of my interpretation of the social context in Sydney. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen. Just let me organize my pictures. Okay. Yes, so this work is work that I'm doing as part of the Sydney Speaks project, which is a project that is sponsored by the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the very large team of people who've been involved in helping. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out my camera. Okay. a large team of people who've been involved in helping put this project together, including students and research collaborators and research assistants, etc. And in particular, I'd like to highlight today some of the University of Sydney students who've been involved, because there have been several of them and some of them are here. One is Eleanor Sheard, who did her honours thesis with you in 2019, and she's now a PhD student on the project. Carly Bray, Baupu He, and Talia Walker Carly Bray and Baupu He, I believe, were undergraduate linguistics students there, and Sam Poulos and Talia Walker are also students of the University of Sydney in languages and in English. So yes, so thanks to the great team. What we're interested in looking at in the Sydney Speaks project is addressing some of the fundamental sociolinguistic questions around social conditioning of language variation and change. And we're interested in social groups, such as groups by age, gender, social class, or ethnicity, and what impact these have on patterning, and whether these groups actually are distinguished linguistically or not. In Sydney Speaks, we're particularly interested in ethnicity across the city and in Australian English, and we've been finding that ethnic variation is best observed in interaction with other factors, and in particular with social class, to the point that these two cannot really be analysed independently, we would argue, or at least ethnicity couldn't be analysed independently of social class. The relationship between ethnicity and social class is not new. This has been talked about quite extensively, and it's been proposed in work in the United States, in Europe, and also in Australia, that ethnic varieties tend to be associated with working class speech. So in her work in multicultural London English and talking about the emergence of ethnolects in London and more broadly across Europe, Cheshire and colleagues have noted that people of different language backgrounds have settled in already quite underprivileged neighbourhoods, and economic deprivation has led to the maintenance of close kin and neighbourhood ties. And then this is an environment that is particularly propitious to the development of different ways of speaking, of ethnolectal ways of speaking. Of course, ethnic communities may also be of higher socioeconomic status, and this is the case, for example, for Jewish Canadians that Boberg has talked about, and Asian Americans, in particular in the work of Becker. And it's been noted that these groups participate and may even lead sound change and other changes going on in the language. And Callan Galwan Forbes noted that ethnic minority groups favour the accent of the dominant majority, especially in contexts where the advantages associated with the majority are salient. So in these kind of upwardly mobile communities, we may expect to see less ethnic differences than we may see in more working class communities. Sydney's a particularly ideal area for studying this kind of thing, given the way ethnicity and social class are distributed across the city. So this is a map of the percentage of different, in each suburb, the percentage of the population that reported speaking a language other than English at home from the 2016 census. So we're looking forward to results next year to see how this has changed over time. So overall in Sydney, the proportion of people who report speaking a language other than English is around 38%, but you can see that this varies enormously across different suburbs, ranging from as low as very close to 0 to as high as nearly 90%. And the darker colours here represent higher proportion of speakers of languages other than English. And you can see that these are geographically quite constrained and associated in particular with the west and the southwest of Sydney. We can compare this to relative different measures of privilege or advantage across the city. And here's a map from the same census demonstrating median weekly household income. And in this case, the darker colour represents a higher median weekly income. And you can see that it's almost a mirror image of the language map, reflecting that these highly diverse areas are also tend to be lower in median weekly household income. And Nick pointed out to me this morning that the language map resembles quite a lot the COVID map. And I told him that that was actually the motivation for pursuing this topic, because across Australia, people are talking about Western Sydney and Southwestern Sydney, and this has become known across Australia as a distinct region in a way that it wasn't before. And so I thought, what a great opportunity to pursue how this is working in language. This geographical and social divide has also been looked at in multiple different ways, and one way that it's been looked at is by a division according to a Latte line that some of you might have come across. It received quite a bit of media several years ago, and this is a metaphorical line that divides the city from going up from the airport northwest through Parramatta, and it separates out more affluent regions in the north and the east from less affluent regions in the west. One study, the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue Group, produced a discussion paper where they drew on a whole range of different studies supporting or showing evidence for the social divide that exists across these regions. So if you live in the West, you are likely to have a lower taxable income. You're more likely to be admitted to hospital for a potentially preventable illness. You are less likely to have a bachelor's degree and more likely to have a Cert 3 or 4. And people on the west of the line are more likely to have a below average NAPLAN result. So in multiple measures, we get this social distinction on these two sides of the line. Sorry. And what we're interested in here then is, do we also get these linguistic differences? Do these social differences play out linguistically? So there've been some studies of this, and there's some evidence that there are some distinctions. So for example, in one study done by Cox and Palthorpe, they compared vowel realizations by speakers from the northern beaches, from the northern suburbs and from the western suburbs. And they compared a total of 18 vowels in a red word list, HVD context, from 95 what they described as general Australian English speakers. And they found that the Western suburbs speakers were significantly different for multiple vowels. And in general, the Western group were associated with broader realizations, which would be consistent with the social class differences that I've just talked about. And in comparing social class in the different regions, they found that the regional differences held independently of social class. This contrasts with some work that we've done looking at speakers from across Sydney in the Sydney Speaks project, and we looked in this work at 5 diphthongs, which were included in Cox's study, and looking at data from sociolinguistic interviews from the Sydney Speaks corpus with 220 speakers recorded in the 1970s and the 2010s. And we found that there are we didn't find any systematic regional differences in either time period. We found general movement away from broader realizations over time, and we found that social class was relevant in the 1970s, but with this movement away from broader realizations, that difference had broken down for the 2010s. But even in the 1970s, where social class was relevant, there wasn't a large regional difference. Another way in which people have explored linguistic differences across Sydney is looking at language ideologies. And this is work by Eleanor Sheard in an article published in AJL in 2019, where she compared language ideologies from participants in the northern beaches and compared them with Western Sydney. And she looked at 2 particular features, their attitudes to use and to like. And for use, generally the participants agreed that this is not proper grammar. Some of them perceived it as bogan. They noted that it was used by people from the western suburbs, and in order to hear it, you just go to Penrith Station. So very much an association between use and the western suburbs. It was agreed on by the 2 groups. For like, there were some differences. The Northern Beaches participants associated like with themselves. They recognised themselves as users of this, and they associated it with femininity, with wealth, with youth, and with America. So some nice quotes from her participants. It's used by rich, posh girls and people in LA who are about 20 and have $1 million houses. The Western Sydney participants, like the Northern Beaches participants, perceived them associated like with the North, Hunters Hill type people, but also had slight negative attitudes to it, that it was, blonde, prancy ass girls who'd use it, or annoying girls that don't shut up. Interestingly, though, there were these ideologies about these differences that she found no evidence of actual differences in usage across the two regions, and use didn't occur at all in the interviews like occurred extensively, and she didn't observe any differences between the Western Sydney and the Northern Beaches participants. So the ideologies, yeah, are there, but it wasn't borne out in the usage. We can also turn to commentary on ethnic and regional differences to try to understand linguistic differences across Sydney. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with these, that people make a lot of comments about regional differences. And I'll play you two examples from two participants in our study who are talking about precisely this, talking about ethnic and regional differences.
Yeah, like the Middle Eastern boy kind of accent. It's really easy, like, and people just spot it straight away. And if anyone ever says, like, if you say Western Sydney, and they'll start to do that accent, like, that's the first thing that they do, like, they associate it with it.
Like a superwog sort of accent?
Exactly right, yeah.
Okay, so clearly certain associations there, and if we have a listen,
like again, it's not necessarily an Asian thing.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a factor, but it could be, there's an Eastern Suburbs accent.
True.
That to me would be less surprising
Yeah.
than an accent that is Asian Australian. Yeah,
Mm.
because like if you go out to the West, then yes, there is definitely a Western Sydney accent and there's Western Sydney slang.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a thing.
so these speakers sort of talk about ethnic differences, but they suggest that this is tied to and possibly even overridden by region. So in Western Sydney, we get this idea of the Middle Eastern boy or the superwog accent, and then this association between the Eastern Suburbs and Asian Australians. So then all of this then raises the question of just what is the relationship between ethnicity, social class in region in Sydney. We know that these regions are quite socially distinct, but does that also function as a kind of linguistic barrier, weakening the viability or the robustness of the notion of a Sydney speech community, or do the linguistic patterns cross these social and geographical divides? Yes. Okay. So these are questions that we're addressing then within the Sydney Speaks project, and we're working with today I'll be presenting results from two distinct corpora. One is the Sydney Social Dialect Survey that was collected by Barbara Horvath in the 1970s and 80s, and I must say that I'm indebted to her for making her cassettes available that allows us then to do these really fascinating real-time analyses on the data. And from her corpus, we'll be looking at, today I'll be talking about results from So she recorded two age groups, adults and teenagers. And of those, I will be talking today on results from Anglo adults and Anglo Greek and Italian teenagers. And we're still in the process, although we've paused for obvious reasons, of collecting the Sydney Speaks 2010s or 2010s, 2020s corpus, for which, again, we've got two age groups, adults and young adults. And today I'll be talking about the patterning of Anglo, Italian and Chinese Australians. We have also collected data on Greek Australians, and one of our wonderful RAs who's been doing those interviews is here, and we're still in the process of analysing that data. So that's forthcoming. So the participants that we have, when I talk about Anglo, I'm using that as shorthand for Anglo-Celtic. These are people whose parents and grandparents were born in Australia and they grew up in an English-speaking household. And for Italian, Greek and Chinese, I'm referring to children of migrants from Italy, Greece and Hong Kong who were either born in Australia or arrived before the age of 6. So all are native speakers of Australian English, and of different heritage. And the Chinese, just to clarify, it's Cantonese speaking background Chinese. So when I say China, it's specifically from Guangzhou, but most of them are actually, their parents are from Hong Kong. These are the participant numbers across the different groups for the results that I'll be reporting on today. So you can see of the 4 time points that we have, for Anglos, we have representation across the 4 time points. For Italians, we have representation across 3 of the 4, and this is because of their migration histories, because in the 1970s, when Barbara Horvath was collecting her data, there weren't large populations of adult second-generation Italians, and so we start from the teens and have data through to today. For the Greek Australians, it's the same situation in the 1970s as the Italians. And as I said, data collection is still underway for the 2010s and analysis is still underway. So they won't be talking about them today. For the Chinese, we just have the 2010s young adults. And again, this is due to migration history. This is a newer migrant community. So it's only young adults today where we see a large numbers of second generation of Chinese. So we're constrained by the nature of the migration patterns and that reflecting the social nature of Sydney over time, actually. Okay, so social class is what we're particularly interested in. How have we done this? So the results that I'll present today, we've applied a composite measure for which we've summed together scores from 3 different components: occupation, level of education, and type of high school. And the scores along these measures range from 3 to 14, and this gives us a continuum against which we can chart participants. So the lowest speakers with a 3 would have scored 1 point for each of these, or a 14 is if they scored maximum points. And here are some examples of where people might sit. So one of our participants is a high carpet layer with high school education who attended a state school. So he gets a score of 3. And another is a psychiatrist with a master's degree who attended an independent school. So they get a 14. And you can see we get different combinations along the way, and we're able to take all these into account for a continuous measure. Now, how do these social classes fit across our participants? This plot shows the distribution of participants, for the moment, just for Anglo speakers across the different social groups. So we've got the socioeconomic status on the horizontal axis, broken down for our 4 age groups: the 1970s adults and teens, and the 2010s adults and young adults. And in each age bracket, the further to the right represents higher socioeconomic status, and the height of the density represents the proportion of participants. So you can see that for the Anglos, and we have relatively even proportion, but you can see that there's a general shift from a tendency more towards the lower end, slightly more towards the higher end, which is partly a reflection of the nature of society and greater access to education for all, for example. For the Italians, you can see that for the 1970s 10s, they were skewed slightly more to working to the lower ends of the continuum than the Anglos were. And the same is so for the 2010s young adults. And for the 2010s adults, we've got that big dip in the middle. We're sort of getting them divided, but they're relatively similar distribution to the Anglos. For the Greek 1970s teens, they're also skewed slightly towards the more working class end, and even slightly more than the Italians. And then for our last group, the Chinese, they're very much skewed towards the higher end. And this, in fact, is entirely consistent, not only with our participants, but is consistent with the nature of this community, the second generation Chinese background Australians, who tend to be very highly educated, work in high status professions, and live in wealthier areas of Sydney. So in this case, we'd say that this is actually quite representative of the nature of the community, and that does have linguistic impacts, as you'll see. So we're interested in the relationship between class and region, and we're going to look at region in 2 different ways. But first of all, let me show you where the participants come from. And thanks very much to Ben Purser for creating these maps. So we have each dot represents a participant, and the larger the dot, the larger the number of participants. And we've got the Anglos in blue, the Greeks in green, the Italians in tan yellow, and on the right, we have Chinese in red for the 2010s. So looking at the 1970s, you can see that the Anglos are relatively centralized. The Greeks occur slightly more over to the east, which is reflective of the Bondi community. And the Italians are also slightly more constrained and more down towards the south and the southwest than the Anglos. For the 2010s, consistent with the nature of the way in which Sydney has grown and spread, our Anglos are from a much wider range. Italians continue to be largely focused in that kind of west-southwestern region, and the Chinese Australians are more focused towards the north, the region, more concentrated in the north. In terms of the Latte line that I mentioned earlier and that we will be using, here we can add in the green line represents the Latte line, just to show at this point that we do have participants for each community on either side of the Latte line, meaning that we can do comparisons for that. And that's of course relevant for the 2010s only, not relevant for the 1970s, which I'll show you actually is indeed the case. So then how do we translate that into something that we can measure against class? So for this, we use the Index of Relative Socioeconomic Advantage, which is a socioeconomic index that's used by the Australian Bureau of Statistics to rank areas. And it considers a range of information about people and households, including income, their qualifications, their education, but also all sorts of other measures, such as if they have a car, their internet access, and a whole host of measures to come up with a score that is then ranked on a 10-point scale. And one advantage of this measure is that it's been run since 1986. So we're able to use the 1986 census data to determine the relative suburb privilege of our 1970s participants, and then we've used the 2016 data to get for the contemporary participants. And this chart shows the relationship between relative suburb privilege along the horizontal axis and socioeconomic status along the vertical axis. It's again broken down for our 4 age groups, and the different communities are given in different colours. And we would, well, as expected, almost all lines go in the predicted direction. Participants of higher socioeconomic status tend to reside in suburbs that score higher on the IRSD measure, exactly as we'd predict. But actually, it's quite a weak correlation for most of these. The 1970s data is a very weak correlation, and for the Anglos there in green, they actually go in the opposite direction. They also have a very narrow range of suburbs across which they live. For the 2010s young adults, it's also quite weak, and the sharpest correlation is for the 2010s adults. And I'm happy to talk at the end about how we determined what suburb to put people in, which itself is actually not a straightforward question because people do move around a little bit, which may be related to some of this. And then also the Latte line is the second regional measure that we will look at. So here to understand the distribution of the Latte line, I've charted, again, socioeconomic status on the vertical axis. And here we've got, I'll just show you the 1970s data first, 1970s adults and the teens, broken down by community, and participants above the Latte line are in the lighter orange and below the Latte line are in the darker orange. And we would expect higher socioeconomic status. We would expect the participants of higher socioeconomic status to tend to reside above the Latte line. And you can see for the 1970s, it actually is not the case, which makes sense. It's a contemporary thing. But so the Latte line was not relevant at that time. But for the 2010s, it is actually highly relevant. And you can see that for each age and community group, it is consistently the case that speakers with higher socioeconomic status tend to reside above, are more likely to reside above the Latte line than those with lower socioeconomic status. So justifying this as a measure against which we might want to compare patterns of language use. Okay, so having laid out then the social measures, the linguistic variable that I'm going to be looking at is ing. And it's variable realization between the velar and the alveolar realizations. And this is a variable that has been widely studied in sociolinguistic research across many English-speaking regions. And consistently, the studies have found that this is a case of stable variation, that in is here to stay. It's been around for a very long time and it's still widely used. And it's also consistently socially marked, with the alveolar variant being favoured in more casual speech by men and by lower social classes. This has also been looked at in Australia by Horvath in the Sydney Social Dialect Survey, also by Schnuckel in Cessnock, just regional town just north of Sydney, and Chopin among ANU university students actually. And they found very similar social patterning. which is exactly what we would expect. But interestingly, it hasn't been looked at since that time. So time to revisit in Australia. I'll play you 2 examples so you can hear from our 1970s adults. So first, Hugh, a doctor, and you'll hear he produces a velar realization, and you'll also notice that his vowels sound very middle class, which is consistent with this social evaluation of this feature.
Certainly, I can remember playing hide and seek quite frequently.
We'll compare this with Gregory, a meat deliverer.
Just listening, watching, and they were willing to show you.
Okay, so that's the variation that we're looking at. We extracted 14,000 tokens from the Sydney Speaks data, and these were auditorily coded as in or ing. And I would like to thank the 2018 summer scholars who got started on this project and coded the 1970s data, and Ben Purser, who's coded the 2010s data. So first of all, let's look at the rate of in over time. So this chart shows for all of our speakers, lumping everyone in together, how the rate varies across age over time. And I've included the token numbers for each age group under there. So particularly notable here is, of course, that big jump up for the 1970s teens. And this we would interpret as consistent with the adolescent peak, where adolescents might peak in use of a non-standard feature, and then they sort of come into line as they enter the workforce and move away from that. And this has been described specifically for ing across a number of regions, and is a generally widely recognized phenomenon. From that adolescent peak, we see gradual decline in use, such that the 2010s young adults end up with a very similar rate to the 1970s adults, reflecting probably general stability across the community over time, consistent with what's been found across English across the world. But how does that then differ by community and class? So in terms of the conditioning then, well, firstly, I'll just very briefly say in terms of the linguistic conditioning, we find that the alveolar invariant is favoured by verbs over nouns. It's favoured in the context where it precedes a coronal rather than other different sounds, and it's favoured in 2-syllable words. And I'm not going to deal with more with the linguistic conditioning today. We're going to focus on the social conditioning, so looking at age, gender, and ethnicity, but also social class using this composite measure that I described, and then these 2 measures of region that I've just been through. And I've run a series of generalized linear mixed effects models, and I'm going to present a series of visualizations from those models. So you're going to see several charts like this one. And I've run different models for age groups and communities because the nature of the data doesn't allow us to collapse everyone in together because of the kinds of social differences over time that I've been talking about. So for this first set of charts, we're focusing just on the Anglo Australians and comparing for social class. So, and you've got the 4 age groups. So the 1970s adults and the 1970s teens are presented on the left, and then the 2010s adults and young adults on the right. We've got males in tan and females in maroon in the lines. The horizontal axis indicates socioeconomic status, so further to the right is higher socioeconomic status. And the vertical axis represents the rate of the alveolar variant, so higher up means higher rate of the non-standard alveolar. And what we see here is pretty much as we would expect. For the 1970s data, we get significant effects for gender. Men use this feature a lot more than women. And we get significant effect for age, which is the adolescent peak, the rise by the teenagers that we saw earlier. We also get a very strong social class effect for most groups, but we don't get a social class effect for the females. If you can see on the left, the red line is relatively flat. And this is in fact the only group who's not susceptible to socioeconomic class. But otherwise we get a very robust class effect. For the 2010s adults, we get significant effects for gender. And again, we get an effect for social class in precisely the predicted direction. The higher the social class, the less use, the lower the rate of use of the less likely you are to use the alveolar variant. And in fact, you can also see that this means that the gender differences are much sharper at the lower end of the social hierarchy than they are at the higher end. For the 2010s, adults' age is not significant. So the Anglos have that adolescent peak and it just drops right off. And today there's no difference between the adults and the young adults. So given that we do have an effect for class, it's very reasonable to ask, well, do we have an effect for region? And in fact, it turns out that we don't. So these charts replicate what we saw before, but this time, instead of measuring socioeconomic status, measuring relative suburb privilege in the form of the IRSD. And for the 1970s, we have no effect for suburb. You can see the lines are sloping in the right direction. And in particular, for the males, it's actually quite sharp, but it's not significant. And that's largely reflected by this very large confidence interval. If you remember, the Anglos also had a very narrow range of suburbs in which they resided. So that's probably why this has not come out as significant, although it looks like there's an effect. And for the 2010s, it's really quite straightforward that the lines are virtually flat. So although the 2010s retain the social class effect, the suburb that they live in does not make a difference. So what about Greek and Italian Australians? That's for the Anglo Australians. Now moving on to Greek and Italian. Here on the left, we've got the Greek and Italian 1970s teens, and you can see in some ways it looks very similar to what we saw for the Anglos. So here we get the same effect for gender, favouring of in by males. We do get a community effect here with a lower rate of use by Greek Australians than the Italians and by the Anglos. Although the Anglos aren't shown here. And we get the same social class effect that we saw before, that we saw for the Anglos. For the 2010s, and now I've just got the Italians here because we haven't, as I said, analysed the Greek data yet, but comparing across the 2010s, we get the same effect for gender. In this case, we do get an effect for age, which is because the 2010s adults are continuing that relatively high rate of the teenagers, and then it drops off for the young adults. So the Italians to some degree are sort of behind the Anglos in dropping off of this rate of use of in over time. And we get the same social class effect, which is what's of most interest to us here. So again, if we're getting social class, what happens with suburb? Do we get a suburb effect? And here are the results for suburb. So looking first on the left at the Greek and Italian 1970s teens, we do get an effect for suburb, but only for the males. So you can see that the female lines are basically flat, but Greek and Italian male teens, just as they're responsive to class, they're also responsive to suburb. And we'll return to thinking about why that is the case in a minute. And for the 2010s, that effect is retained, but it's marginal. It's not nearly as strong. It's quite weak, but it's just sort of peeking through. So we're getting certainly more sensitivity to suburb for the Greek and Italian male teens, and for the 2010s Italians than we are getting for the Anglos, where the Anglos just are oblivious to suburb. What about the Chinese Australians? So the Chinese Australians really need no comment. You can look at it and you can see exactly what's going on. They use this feature, this non-standard feature, very minimally, and there's no effect for gender and there's no effect for social class. And so, of course, it's no surprise that there's also no effect for suburb. Yeah, they don't. There's no social conditioning there. And that they use the feature very little, which is consistent with what we've seen for other features for this group, where they tend to orient towards overtly prestigious forms, consistent with the middle class nature of this community that I showed you earlier. So this then brings us to the last measure to look at, the second measure in terms of region, for which I just have the one set of graphs, the Latte line, and we'll just look at the 2010s here, because as I showed you, it doesn't apply to the 1970s, comparing Anglo-Chinese and Italians. So if you remember, for the Anglos, there was a class effect, there was no suburb effect, and there is no Latte line effect. So let me explain these charts to you. Again, the vertical axis is the rate of the alveolar variant, and here we're contrasting the rate for participants who lie below versus those who lie above the Latte line. Male and females again are distinguished, and you can compare for each age group here. For the Anglos, there's no difference where you sit in relation to the Latte line. So not for the Anglos, not only does individual suburb ranking suburbs on a 10-point scale, that doesn't have an effect, but even if we go to a broader range of just north-south of the, or east-west of the Latte line, or north-south, we don't get an effect. For the Chinese also, we don't get effect, which is hardly surprising. We don't get any social conditioning for the Chinese. We wouldn't expect to get an effect. For the Italians, we do in fact get a significant effect, and this is stronger than the breakdown for the individual suburbs. And you can see this quite clearly here, and it applies for the males at both age groups, and it applies for the females in both age groups. So the Italians are marginally sensitive to relative suburb prestige, and quite sensitive to this broader measure of the Latte line. So to summarize then all that mass of graphs that you've seen, that in case you haven't quite got every single detail, what we've seen is that in terms of gender is quite consistent, that we get higher rates of in for males across the board, with the exception of the 2010s young adult Chinese, who just avoid the variable. For age, we also get quite some consistency. We get adolescent peak for all groups, and for all groups we end up with, we start off with our 1970s adults and end up with the 2010s young adults with a similar rate of use, but the course of the different communities across the 4 time points does vary slightly, which we see when we look at community. So comparing community groups to their age cohorts, we get lower rates of in for 1970s Greek teens, and we get lower rates for 2010s young adult Chinese. And in both cases, we can explain this by in terms of the orientation of these communities to overtly prestigious forms, as I think I mentioned earlier. So for the young adult Chinese, this is hardly surprising, because we saw that socially they are very much skewed towards the more middle class end of the continuum. For the Greek teens, they weren't, if you remember, they were actually quite low down. So this is particularly interesting that they should exhibit this. And I think this can be, well, it's consistent with what Horvath observed for their vowels, that the Greek teenagers tended towards the more cultivated end for the vowels. So there's something, perhaps some kind of usage going on here to try to concrete orientation towards these overtly prestigious forms. We find higher rates of in for the 2010s adult Italians. If you remember, they were higher than the 2010s young adults, so they're also higher than the Anglos. And this is surprising and somewhat harder to explain, but perhaps Boberg's observations regarding Italian Canadians might be helpful here. And he's talked about the local covert prestige and symbolic masculinity of distinctively Italian sounding speech. And it's possible that there's something like that going on for the 2010s adults that is then sort of washed out for the 2010s young adults. And I would be very happy to hear the perceptions of the audience, in particular our Italian Sydney-siders, in terms of that interpretation. For social class, which of course is what we're most interested in, we get a predicted result. We get higher rates of in with lower socioeconomic status across the board, except for the 1970s Anglo adult females, which is possibly due to their putting on their very best English for the interview. It's an interview effect. Now, we don't find this for their vowels, because they do exhibit social variation for the vowels, but perhaps ing is a more salient variable, and so they're avoiding it in this interview context in a way that none of the other speakers do. Again, no effect for the 2010s young adult Chinese, because they just don't use the feature. They don't enter very little into the variation. In terms of region, looking at relative suburb privilege, we found no effect for the Anglos. They're not sensitive to that. The 1970s teen Greek and Italian males are, but not the females. So why this might be the case, when we look at the data, the 1970s teen Greek and Italian males are generally happen to be from lower ranked suburbs than the females, which I think is just an accident of the data. But it may well be that because of this, there's more sensitivity at the lower ranked, more sensitivity in the lower social classes, and therefore they're more sensitive to suburb. It's also important to note that the male's higher overall rate gives more opportunity for further social differentiation. The female's rate is lower, and so they've got sort of less room to move, if you like. We also find a marginal effect for the 2010s adult and young adult Italians for suburbs. So this is sort of being retained through for the Italians. And in relation to that, these are the groups that we do find an effect for the Latte line. And the 2010s adult Italians is also the group that has a high rate of in. And so again, it may be the case that the high rate of in then allows for more social differentiation within that. And this was also the group that had the strongest correlation between social class and suburb. So it seems to be that there may genuinely be something going on with the distribution of the Italian community, that it's more constrained by social class and suburb in a way that the Anglos aren't. And certainly we saw that they are from a more refined, more tightly constrained area. The participants come from a narrower range for the Italians than the Anglos. So overall then, in terms of ethnicity and social class in a modern metropolis, we have certainly seen that social class is a major driver of variation in the Sydney community, and this cuts across ethnic differences, such that for the Chinese, it's, we would say, social class that's driving their behaviour more than other features. Region has a more limited scope than social class, without a doubt. I think it's important to note in trying to interpret these results that region is, of course, a reflection of multiple measures. People who live in the wealthier regions generally earn more money in order to pay for those more expensive houses. And their kids go, or the kid, they have been to better schools, that then opens up more opportunities. They have higher status of education. So all of this is kind of a package. And once we compare income, school type and education as a package to region, it makes sense that it's those other features that are going to have more impact there. It's also important to note that people move across regions. So people may live 20 years in one region and 20 years in another region. And so that will make region less likely to have an impact. And also important to note that regions change over time. So we have some participants who have lived in Glebe for 40 years, and Glebe was not the same status in the 1970s that it is today. So of course that's going to affect that. So it seems that there's multiple complicating factors that go on with suburb that mean that it has much more limited scope, and also that it impacts some groups more than others, which is perhaps particularly interesting, that it's the Italians that are more impacted by region than the Anglos, which I would love to discuss. So then overall, we would highlight that socioeconomic status of ethnic communities impacts their patterning, and this is a consistent thing that we're finding across all of the variables that we're looking at in the Sydney Speaks data, that ethnicity and social class are very strongly tied together, and the best way to interpret the effects for ethnicity is to interpret them in relation to social class. So thank you, and thanks again to the Sydney Speaks team.